Sometimes the most chilling prophecies aren't about giant armies or cosmic battles. They're about something much closer to home. There's this one single, cryptic verse from the ancient prophet Zechariah that paints a picture of a city's doom. But the real horror? It's not what you think. Let's decode this thing.
Okay, so here's the verse itself. Zechariah 14, verse 1. Behold, the day of the Lord cometh, and thy spoil shall be divided in the midst of thee. Wow, the language is pretty stark, right? It's talking about judgment, about plunder, but there's that really strange twist. What on earth does it mean for a city's spoils, its treasures, its wealth, to be divided inside its own walls? That's the puzzle we're going to solve today.
All right, to get to the bottom of this, we have to put on our historical detective hats. Seriously, we need to break this verse down piece by piece, because the clues to solving this prophecy, well, they aren't waiting for us in some distant future. They're actually buried in the pages of history.
So, let's start with that powerful opening phrase, the day of the Lord. Now, this isn't talking about just any random Tuesday. In prophetic language, this is a huge deal. It's a well-known term for a time of intense divine judgment. It basically signals that a major, history-altering event is about to go down.
Now, when people try to interpret what this day is, you basically get two main schools of thought. Some will tell you it's pointing to a future, final battle, an Armageddon-type event. But there's another really compelling case that points to a specific catastrophe that already happened, the complete destruction of Jerusalem back in 70 AD. And for this deep dive, it's that historical evidence we're going to be focusing on.
And that brings us right back to the weirdest part of the whole verse. Thy spoil shall be divided in the midst of thee. Think about that for a second. This doesn't sound like your typical story of an invading army breaking down the gates and looting the city. No, the language here hints at something way more tragic, something like a collapse from the inside out. So, to really understand how this prophecy could have played out, we need to jump in our time machine and go back to Jerusalem right before 70 AD. The city was an absolute pressure cooker, teetering on the edge of collapse. But the biggest threat wasn't the Roman legions camped outside the walls. It was the chaos that was absolutely exploding from within.
So how did it all go so wrong? Well, it started when these radical zealot factions just violently took over, overthrowing the city's established leaders. They even turned the Holy Temple itself into their personal fortress. One historian literally called it a shop of tyranny. So instead of uniting to defend the city, the leadership completely fractured. And that set the stage for a brutal, vicious civil war.
And this is where it gets crazy. The city literally split into 3 warring territories, each run by a different warlord. You had John of Gischala, who held the temple's outer court, then there was Eleazar, who controlled the inner court, and finally Simon Bar Giroa, who had most of the rest of the city. And get this, their main goal wasn't fighting the Romans, it was wiping each other out.
So you have this three-way power struggle, this civil war raging inside the city walls, and the consequences were just horrifying. This infighting didn't just weaken Jerusalem's defenses, it actively started to tear the city apart, basically lighting the fuse on Zechariah's prophecy. The path to ruin was just systematic self-destruction. First, the infighting kicks off, but then they do something that is just mind-bogglingly self-defeating. They start burning the city's food supplies. John's faction burns the grain controlled by Simon's party, and then Simon's guys do the same thing back to them. We're talking about enough grain to feed the entire city for years, just torched in an act of petty sabotage. They deliberately created a famine, and as if that wasn't bad enough, they then guarded the exits, killing any of their own people who tried to escape the starving city they had just created.
The Roman philosopher Seneca once said something that fits this situation perfectly. A city divided against itself is already half taken. And in Jerusalem's case, it was way more than half. This self-inflicted chaos basically guaranteed that by the time the Roman legions finally broke through the walls, they found a city that was already starving, demoralized, a city that had already defeated itself.
And this is where it all comes full circle, right back to the prophecy itself. When you take the historical record, what we know actually happened, and you lay it right on top of Zechariah's words, the meaning becomes just devastatingly clear.
This is it, the devastating fulfillment of the prophecy. The spoil Zechariah talked about, it wasn't just the gold and silver the Romans eventually carted off. No, the most vital spoil, the food, the resources, human lives, even hope itself, that was divided and destroyed from within first.
The factions plundered each other. They burned their own city's lifeline. The prophecy of spoil being divided in the midst of the was fulfilled literally and so tragically by Jerusalem's own hand.
So this leaves us with a final, really powerful question to think about. When you see a prophecy like this fulfilled, not by some supernatural bolt from the blue, but by the horribly predictable consequences of human division and infighting, how does that change the way we read these ancient texts? Maybe it shows us that the most powerful prophecies aren't just about predicting the future. Maybe they're timeless warnings about us.